would be aware, if you do tune into podcasts, the Huberman Lab podcast, which is actually ranked as the #1 health podcast in the world, hosted by Dr. Andrew Huberman. He's an American neuroscientist who's an associate professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford University School of Medicine. Pretty amazing accolades there. And he gets up to a load of other things. But it was actually during Andrew's podcast, What Alcohol Does to Your Brain, Body and Health, that really cemented my sobriety well over a year ago. So if you've not dialed into the Huberman Lab podcast, do yourself a favour. There's something for everyone in that solid gold collection. Now, one of the last parts of my daily ritual is to queue up the media I'll be listening to on my next morning jaunt. And it gives me something to look forward to in my sleep, a reason to get up, and saves me in that terrible time decision making when it's so hard first thing in the morning to get your brain churning. So late last year, I queued up a Huberman Lab podcast. It's not the only one I listened to, by the way, but this one was about mental health, and it's an obvious area of interest for me. But I had no idea what I was in for, and it was one of the best 12 hours and 40 minutes exactly of learning I've experienced in a very, very long time. Now, there's only 24 hours in a day, so this was consumed over many mornings and many months because I listened to it over and over again. So in this podcast, I met Dr. Paul Conti. He's also a Stanford and Harvard trained psychiatrist who has empowered the lives of many, many people around the globe, including Lady Gaga, Kim Kardashian and Tommy Hilfiger. Hilfiger, I don't even know how you say that, but we all know that brand. But in this podcast, supported by the legendary Andrew Huberman hosting Paul, he presented the human condition through sense-making dialogue, mind-blowing models that had me listening to this 4-part series, as I said before, over and over again during the ensuing months. Never failing to learn something new every time I listened, and most importantly, being able to apply it to my real world, not only my clients, but in many cases to myself. So in the spirit of true gratitude and Rae Bonney, I emailed Dr. Paul to thank him for providing ways of showing my clients a clearer perspective of self. And also, I cheekily requested a radio interview, not expecting there to be any response at all. So I was pretty astounded by his generosity and quietly crapping myself, perhaps getting in over my head, as Paul did not hesitate in accepting. So this week we connected Portland, Oregon with Melbourne, Australia over Zoom, and it was amazing, a little bit nerve-wracking, and you'll hear as I play our Zoom recording that it does involve some crossed wires of whoever was on the line between Portland and Melbourne. So there's bits of chatter in the background, but it does not take away from Paul's very powerful responses to my somewhat nerve-wracked questions. I was trying really hard to keep within the very hard 30 minutes that Paul's very generous assistant had allowed me. Very fortunately, though, the interview went for almost an hour. So a lot of the time I was sitting on the edge of my seat thinking, this is going to end any second. But you will hear the moment at the finish when Paul realises he's gone way over time and really, really needs to pivot. So as we play through the interview, I'll also be providing little pieces of my own commentary and illustrations as we move through the show today. But before we get started, usually I have a guest in the studio and we play a game called Very Special Guest Song Request, where there's a lot of cryptic clues and it's a bit of a game. So I don't have a guest today, so I'm giving a big shout out to my daughter Rose, son-in-law Josh, and my very divine, beautiful, heart-stopping granddaughter Evelyn for helping me by providing our song list for today. They do love their music, and Rose was brought up on a recipe of Fleetwood Mac, Elton John, Enya, oh gosh, who else? Elvis Presley, of course. So I'm really heartened to know that she's gone way out of scope on that and found her very own song preferences. 14 minutes past 11, and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney, and today I'm airing a very special moment I shared earlier this week with world-renowned Stanford and Harvard psychiatrist Dr. Paul Conti. We just heard an amazing little tune requested by none other than my daughter Rose. It was Charlie Crockett with I Need Your Love, and I can't get enough of her love, and I know she's just tuned in, so there you go, Rose. A big hug for you, Josh and Evelyn, and we're going to be hearing all about Josh and Evelyn as we move through the show because all of the music has been requested by them, and thank you so much for taking that load off me. So we're going to go straight to the recording with Paul. We start off with a little bit of an insight to where Paul started in his career. So stay tuned as I said, as we move through a bit of a technical jungle. So here we go. Here's Paul Conti. Paul Conti, what an absolute honour it is to be seeing you and speaking to you today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor for me to be on. I appreciate it.
Well, I first met you removed through Andrew Huberman in the Huberman Lab podcast and this amazing 4-part series that you did with him around mental health. And then since then, I see that you knock around with some pretty famous people, including our Tiffany Cook here in Australia, who's also a great friend of mine. So I feel incredibly grateful that you've made some time for me today.
Pleasure. It's a pleasure.
You didn't start your career as a psychiatrist or physician, did you?
No, I think became a psychiatrist. I was in my early 30s. So I had a business career before medicine, and then went back and did another year of college and then applied to medical school. So yeah, I came to it a little bit late.
Well, something that you're very, very well known for, which is a term called generational drive. What is it that drove you to leave the corporate world and enter into something so complex as the human condition?
It's interesting. Like I think the generative drive is part of that. It's not that I couldn't stand what I was doing or there was anything negative about it, but it wasn't satisfying enough. Like there's more. I wanted to understand more. I wanted more direct contact with people. I just wanted more, even though I didn't really know what that was. I mean, it was an earlier stage of life, and I didn't know, but I did know that I wanted more, and that involved learning about the human condition, dealing directly with people, and it drove me away from something I knew and had familiarity with. It was good in many ways towards something I hoped would be better, and I was willing to strive to make better. And I think that's the generative drive in humans. I think we can't explain human behavior, right, without there being a generative drive in us, a drive to create, a drive to impact the world around us, a drive to make better the world around us. And humans have different levels of this drive, and its expression is impacted by all sorts of things inside of us and in the world around us. But this is in us, and I think it impacts career changes. It impacts small acts of kindness. It impacts large acts of heroism. That there's something in us as humans that we don't pay enough attention to, and I think because of that we sort of minimize our humanness because we're not looking at all the ways that we are human, and then we're not able to nurture things that we don't look at and understand. And if there's this truth about us, but we're not just looking at it, but celebrating it, nurturing it, right, then I think it factors very strongly into a lot of the societal problems that we have and a lot of the despair that people feel and sense of hopelessness in a lot of people, because I think that's an expected outcome of not looking at ourselves honestly.
Yes, I totally agree with everything you've said, and it sort of feeds into, for those who know me that are listening in, know that my whole life's purpose is around men's health and also especially suicide prevention, given
Yes.
that most of the social determinants lead into that, and a word comes to me, purpose, and I understand, and I know you've spoken about this publicly, so I'm going to ask you anyway. that your brother died by suicide, which,
Yeah.
was a big impact on your life. Was that part of the purpose for driving you to do what you do?
Well, I think it's easy for me to map it to that, and there is some truth to you being just overwhelmed and baffled and grieving and not wanting this to happen to other people. There is an aspect of that, but there was also an aspect of his suicide that led to me feeling less constrained by a lot of the shoulds, so to speak, in life. That when I look at that, I think that very negative events can have silver linings. And I don't say that in any Pollyanna way. I think that does not happen automatically. I think it's something we have to strive for. But if we look at the human condition and what can happen to us after tragedy, we can see some interesting things. So, I was in my early 20s at the time, and I thought, oh, I have to keep doing this. I can't change. I'm so far down the road that I'll be behind the eight ball if I go back to school. These are all things that were not true, but I felt hemmed in by my own insecurities and vulnerabilities and desire to feel successful, not even from I think from a position of arrogance, but from a position of fear, and it told me, hey, like there are things that happen in the world that are beyond my ability to really comprehend. I want to understand those things better. I mean, here I am still alive and healthy enough to go do that. And then it became much simpler to go do something that it was in me to do. And I had my own depression and my own unhealthy behaviors, unhealthy relationships, and drinking too much. And there were things in me that were unhealthy that likely would have potentially at least become more unhealthy were it not for the realization that, like, hey, there's one life to live here, and there are big important things in it, and I'm going to go do something different. Yes, I'm taking chances, and I'm walking away from a job and an income, but I want to do that. I decide to do that, right? And I think that's how the generative drive in us, we can see it make it a resurgence or have a very strong impact at times after tragedy. And I think that's a big part of what happened to me is that drive came to the surface, and I had enough of kind of living life halfway and telling myself I couldn't do anything different because I was so old at the age of 23 or 24.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, because I'm watching your face and I can see that there's just so much passion and memory coming out of you as you're sort of walking through that story. And that generative drive, I can't even say it. An amazing thing you did, and I have this other question around the pillars of mental health, which is a model that you've built. And I'm wondering, was that built especially for the Andrew Huberman series, or was that something that you had already created prior to that?
Yeah, again, thank you for asking that. That it's a product of, I'm 54 years old, and it's a product of 54 years on Earth, and like being actively involved in life and other people, whether it's as a physician. I mean, certainly things I learned as a physician, as a psychiatrist, were very, very important. Neurobiological facts, psychiatric facts, psychological theories about humans. But there's also the experience of life and of triumph and tragedy, and like there's so much that goes into that was evolving in me as I did the work more and more to see, like, hey, this is how this is working, right? And it's not as if I mean, certainly not claiming I made all of that up de novo. Like there are many, many facts. There's a lot of knowledge in the world around us that doesn't get harvested or utilized, right? And yes, I do believe there's something novel in the things that I said on the Huberman podcast, but most of that is pulling together knowledge that's been out there for a long time, some of it, and not really paid attention to. And I think in the modern world of healthcare or of mental health, this is certainly true in the United States, and I believe it's true in other places, including Australia, that there's just such a focus on efficiency and throughput. But like what does that mean? I mean, efficiency about right now, throughput about right now isn't necessarily a search for truth. And I think mental health isn't looking for truth anymore. It's looking for Band-Aids, right? And like sometimes a Band-Aid is appropriate, but a lot of times a Band-Aid is not appropriate, right? If a person is bleeding, like maybe they need surgery, right? But we try to Band-Aid everything. And I was struck over time that there is so much we know and we do not utilize that knowledge. And when you take the knowledge together, I was also fortunate that some of my training was very strongly brain biology based, and some of it was very strongly psychological theory based. And when you put that together, it was just amazing to me, like a person who really needs shelter, right? And there's a bunch of bricks all around them, but like they don't know to put them all together. And I don't think people aren't supposed to know that. The field is supposed to know that, right? And it came out because I think Andrew and I do really good back and forth, and we're good at getting to the points of things that, like, without his help and us doing it together, I don't know that I would have gotten to something so cogent. But no, that's evolved over years and years, in part through the frustration of becoming a physician and becoming a psychiatrist and seeing, wow, like the expectation is in practice is that I leave 90 something percent of the knowledge at the door and then just try and do band-aid things, which I'm not willing to do. I'm not willing to take that approach.
I would love you to walk through the pillars of mental health model, especially around, the sense of agency and gratitude. And, it sort of, harkens to me around accountability. And I think your model, again, thank you so much. I said this to you online, that this model has helped me make sense for my clients about how to be accountable to themselves, as opposed to going out and seeking these band-aids that you were talking about and them not really, really sticking. But, this model, and also the iceberg model that you've created as well alongside of that. If you can just take us through, I mean, Andrew Huberman uses the word geysering up. So if you imagine, if everyone just takes that word geysering up and, the agency and gratitude piece, I'm going to have you, Paul, to just take us through that model.
Oh,
wow. That's our first segment complete. Dr. Paul Conti certainly packs a lot of words and meaning into a very short space, doesn't he? I actually never tire of hearing him speak about his pillars of mental health model. In fact, I've listened to it over and over myself in an effort to refine it into something really, really useful, practical and powerful for my own clients. And full disclosure, I also now apply this to myself almost unconsciously. We're going to talk about unconscious minds later in the show. But just as a sidebar, before I jump into my interpretation of the model, I wanted to pay respect to the occupation of being curious about the human condition. It never fails to hearten me, the generosity, collaboration, contribution and kindness of people only too willing to share their ideas to help rise up the sector, because we're in a constantly evolving state of change ourselves. And if we're not learning from people and we're just stagnant, say, in formal education or the past, we're not going to really be part of that evolving space. So for those who don't see it as a competitive space, rather a forever opportunity to learn in the service of others, I thank you. This has sat with me for so many years, this idea. I acquired a book years ago when I first started really, really delving into my area of passion. And it was a famous 1980 publication called Existential Psychology by a legend psychiatrist, Irvin Yalom. It sits next to my bed all the time, and I always touch it and refer to it. He talks early on in this tome about a standard recipe that people can randomly throw in their own ingredients to keep building on the original. And in fact, it was, God, I'm sidebarring on a sidebar here, but my bolognese recipe, which has become very famous within my family, my kids love it. It's either bolognese and pasta, or it's lasagna. But that originated from my daughter Rose and my son George's grandmother, Anne. And she taught me, back almost 30 years ago, her Sicilian bolognese recipe. And over the years, I've made it into my own. So I think, in the ideas of the world, nobody owns them. I think if you do have something great, share it and allow people to pick it up and make it into their own, whilst, maintaining your integrity, of course. It's really important. So there's my little piece about the ingredients in which we can all contribute. So it's time to go to the next break already. And when we come back, we're going to hear, of course, my next moment with Dr. Paul Conti. But before we do that, the next song request is from son-in-law Joshua. And it's all mud, stone and whiskey with, you guessed it, a song called Stone from the band Whiskey Myers off their album Mud. Now, isn't that great that I could just mix all of those words together and make it into a little story for myself? Oh, welcome back. The time is just 35 minutes past 11 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney. Today, we're unpacking a pre-recorded interview with Dr. Paul Conti, inspired by the 4-part mental health series from the Huberman Lab podcast. So we're going to go back to where we left off rather abruptly. And by the way, we got to hear just a little bit more of Stone by Whiskey Myers. That wasn't a technical hiccup. That was more just why not get more than the 5 minutes and 36 seconds of that show. But don't go away. Enjoy the next part of my interview with Dr. Paul Conti.
Sure. I mean, I would start by saying, just think about the basic steps if we want to understand something, right? I mean, take somebody who'd never seen a car before, right? And you try and help them understand it, or they're trying to understand it. You would be interested in the structure of the car. Like, what is this thing? What are the parts of it, right? Let me understand how it's built, right? How it works, right? And how it works transitions into the function of self. So like there's a structure and there's a function. And to try and understand complex things, we need to look at both of those things, right? And our minds are as complex as anything, in the universe that we know of, right? We're tremendously complicated, but it doesn't mean we can't understand ourselves. We have to just do it in a way that makes sense. So we start with the structure of ourselves, and then that leads us to the unconscious mind. And most of the brain transmission, most of what goes on in our brains is going on in our unconscious mind. I mean, how can we ignore something that's like that huge part of the iceberg that's underneath the water that is very deterministic of what's going to come into our conscious mind, right? From say an infinite field set of possibilities, it gets narrowed down to things that might be just 2 or 3 by the time we become conscious, and we don't realize that our mind has determined those 2 or 3 possibilities from among so many of them. Like, we have to look at the structure of our mind, which is an unconscious mind, a conscious mind sitting on top of it. Then we have a defensive structure around us. We build a self on top of that. Like, there is a structure that is inside of us that we need to understand if we're going to have any hope of understanding ourselves. Then we have to look at, how does that function? What are defense mechanisms in action like? What's salient in us? Meaning, what's grabbing our attention? What are we paying attention to? There are hundreds of thousands of other things that you and I could be paying attention to at this moment. And they're in our brain to pay attention to, but we're not paying attention to other things. We're paying attention to each other, right? Because there is so much that we are not doing so that we can do this, right? And that's what salience means. What are we paying attention to? What's going on inside of us that has that spotlight of consciousness in us? And if we can look at the structure of our minds, the function of our minds, then we can look at what gets built on top of all of that. And this is where we get to the more sort of the concepts that sit on top of that, including, as an agency, gratitude, humility. These are not just pie in the sky terms, right? These are real ways that we can understand ourselves, characterize ourselves, and find our way to happiness. Like, what does happiness mean? Like, very few of us are actively happy all the time. Like, what are we really looking for? We're looking for peace, right? We're looking for some sense of contentment, some sense of self-worth, some sense of knowing who we are and feeling like that's okay and good enough, right? Then we want things that delight us, that make us really happy. They're like, wow, look at this. Like, whether it's a plant or a person or a work of art, whatever it may be. But we want to feel peace, contentment, and delight. And it really works, right? To use this model because it makes sense that it works. If you're trying to understand the car and you're going to look at its structure and its function, and then what it can be used for and how it can be used productively. You could use a car as a getaway car robbing a bank. Or you could take somebody sick to the hospital, right? So now you're looking at what you can build on top of the structure and function of that thing and how you can define it, right? And this way of understanding ourselves leads it both leads to and from the drives inside of us. That there are drives in us for assertion, for having some effect on the world around us. What often was called an aggression drive, but an assertion drive is a better way to look at that. Like we're asserting ourselves so that we can have some healthy control over the world around us, right? Then there's a pleasure drive, which gets misunderstood. The idea that everybody wants to be hedonistic. This is not what we're talking about. The pleasure can be the pleasure of safety, the pleasure of having a roof over our head when it's raining out. This is pleasure, the pleasure of having enough to eat, of not worrying, right? But then greater pleasures that build on top of that, not greater, but they build on top of that. The pleasure of creativity, the pleasure of learning and knowledge. So we know that we have an assertion drive and a pleasure drive in us, but we can't understand ourselves that way. It's like something is missing. It's like having a tripod and you have two legs of it. Right? Like we know that doesn't work because the tripod falls over, right? It's not a tripod, right? It can't do its thing. And the answer to that, which again, it's not as if I figured this out from nothing, right? I mean, there are people and schools of thought that have conceptualized humans beyond the things that I just said, right? The desire to create anew. Like, why does someone appreciate a work of art? Why does someone create a work of art? They say, well, they want to impact the world around them. They want to get pleasure from it. Yeah, it doesn't really explain all of that, right? It doesn't explain all of that. There's a desire to create something new, right? To change the world around us. So why do people create works of art? To change how you or I might think about ourselves in the world around us, how we might feel when we see the work of art, right? So this is the humanness inside of us that we're really trying to get to. We're trying to understand, how does this come out of us? It's not pleasure. Right? There's something different that's about the whole aspect of being human. I think about people who are raising children and loving a child and wanting a child to be happy and healthy. Right? The explanation, that the joy of having an impact upon that developing human, and knowing that human is then going to develop further with what we've put into that person. Like, you can't explain that other than trying to really live within our humanness. Now, if we're going to do that, we have to be assertive enough to impose ourselves on the world around us. There has to be enough pleasure, so to speak, in our lives that we have resources and safety. Then we can do the things that are really about being human, and those are generative things. And if we take the structure of self, the function of self, what's built on top of it, and we map that to the drives in us, and if we are not happy, there are things that aren't the way we want them to be, we can understand through that model. My assertion is we can understand going on in human beings. Why? Because that's comprehensive. And it comes not just from 100 years of psychological theory that has been better defined, but people were thinking about psychology 1,000 years ago, right? There's knowledge not just through science, but there's knowledge through philosophy, through literature, through observation of the human condition. When you take the things that we know and you say, how about we try and put together a way of understanding humans that actually works and does justice and honors the complexity of us, that into which we can feed our problems or our issues, and then use that in order to make change, to make life better. Like, that is what this is all driving at. And I think it draws upon human traditions of knowledge, and those may be literature, philosophy, science, history, but our interest in ourselves as humans leads us to this, right? That we put together the knowledge we have put together over years and years. We don't ignore it because we're just trying to band-aid things. What do we actually know? And how do we synthesize that and put that together and use it for our benefit? I believe that this is what we come up with. This is what we logically arrive at.
I think, the way that you're illustrating it now, and for listeners, I'll be able to show you the diagram of the model as well. But just say a person has a structure that's quite damaged, and perhaps they've not built any foundation under that through life. So it really is quite rocky. And then, next to that, the function of self is maybe unclear, that because of the unstable structure, maybe function has never been really realized. And then you've got the drivers, the aggression drive and the pleasure drive, and both of those are really, really low, and no awareness of any generator in the middle of that. How does one work with a person like that to activate enough energy to lift off, so to speak. Well, we're going to leave it there and come right back to Paul's answer to that question. But there is so much to be said about structure and function in a human being and making sense of how, what, why, where, and when, and the who of things. By the way, speaking of generational drive, did you know that Paul was actually originally an account manager at PricewaterhouseCoopers in New York City, specialising in corporate employee benefits? I guess that's some way linked to the human condition, but it is really quite a departure given how he's invested in his life in the service of others. So for those that are listening in, if you're thinking about a career change, I'm going to paint a little bit of a picture around the pillars of health that Paul described and how I've interpreted them and brought them into my own practice and my own life. In the last show that we had where I interviewed the amazing Mike Rolls, if you didn't listen in, Mike Rolls is an amazing specimen of the human condition. He, unfortunately, at the age of 18, contracted meningococcal overnight. And he now has lost both of his legs and other parts as well. But he's an amazing demonstration of what you can do with what you've got. And, you know, his whole story involves, you know, generational drive, pleasure, aggression, structure, function of self, and also the way that he has encapsulated trauma and been informed by that. So, you know, going back to what Paul was talking about, the pillars of mental health, I generally start my picture, and I'm going to use myself as an example because I don't want to disclose anyone else's sort of private structures, but my structure of self, you imagine me being born as a child, there's a human structure. Most of the time that's pretty usual, taking away things like perhaps intergenerational trauma and stuff like that, but basically we're a structure. And along the way, our structure, it grows and it develops. And if we're very, very lucky, we'll have parents or carers and guides and mentors that will keep that structure really safe. And then as we develop as human beings, sometimes we can put, you know, extra foundation underneath that structure to keep it really, really stable. In my situation, my childhood was probably not what I would describe as something that helped me stabilize and probably destabilized my structure significantly. So, you know, that structure in itself, really, until I realized just how much work that needed in terms of putting in extra features, you know, new walls, you know, new plaster, new carpet, all those kinds of things, I really operated, you know, very precariously through life. But to the side of that, you know, the function of self, I was very lucky that I always realized what my function was. You know, a lot of people think that my occupation or my purpose in life is about helping people or giving advice to people, and it's actually neither of those things. Could not be further. My function is my curiosity for people, my drive, my thirst for knowledge about the human condition and everybody I meet, and the acquisition of that information that I derive from people, then probably by chance or a byproduct of that is helping, and that is probably people taking, you know, their own perception of advice from that. But really my function is I'm a curious person who happens to be fascinated by the human condition and everything that happens within that. So underneath that we have, you know, a pleasure drive, an aggression drive, and this is what gets really, really interesting. So aggression, as Paul said, and we can interpret aggression as purpose or proactiveness, or, you know, that drive that we get up for. And I'm so fortunate that I was born with an incredibly high drive. It's always been with me, and I'm very, very grateful that I have that in me. I'm always up, I'm always curious, I'm always thinking about things, and my energy levels are really, really high. But then when you look at my pleasure drive, unfortunately, because of my structure, my pleasure drive has been quite low for a lot of, especially my early life before I had children, was very, very low because I guess, you know, that structure didn't enable that pleasure to go up. So guess what? Alcohol became a big part of my life because that was how I thought I got to those high levels of pleasure. My drive was always very high, and sometimes my drive was so high and my pleasure so low that it was misguided. So perhaps it hurt people around me, or just wasn't channeled in a direction that was proactive, that it was positive or constructive. So fortunately, learning that about myself, that where was I going to get pleasure from? And I was very fortunate to have children bestowed upon me who gave me purpose and gave me reason, and just that natural activation of pure joy and happiness. And again, very fortunate that I felt that through parenting. But as I moved through life, finding and taking responsibility and accountability, and that's something I mentioned to Paul when we were speaking, that accountability really, really sits at the very heart of how the human condition finds purpose and takes advantage of that drive. Quite often we'll see people who narrate their own lives around nothing's worked for me. It's because of a person's role in my life that has held me back, or it's kept me down, or it's damaged me. And quite often those people can't move anywhere because, unfortunately, they haven't had this vision or model placed upon them where they can make sense and find some traction on what accountability might be. And another really curious thing about this model is overlaying somebody else's model on top of yours. And this is where we see relationships and the dynamics of relationships either working really, really well or not working well. And I've since discovered that relationships aren't necessarily sustainable or great or wonderful because people have loads of things in common. I mean, it is great to have things in common because you can have shared experiences more often. However, that drive, that aggressive drive, is the thing that I think needs to be mostly matched, because if you've both got a high drive and hopefully an ability to raise your pleasure drive, to high levels, you're most likely going to have a relationship that is really, really healthy and happy and joyful and delightful and all those things that Paul was talking about. So for those that are listening in and interested about how this might look in themselves, once I produce this show onto my YouTube channel, just look for Rae Bonney on YouTube, I'll have the diagrams, links to both diagrams, so you can sort of follow that yourself. Otherwise, do tune in to the Huberman podcast. Just look up Huberman Lab podcast, or Andrew Huberman. And it's the 4 parts were somewhere last year in August, I think, that you can hear those. So goes obviously in 12 hours and 40 minutes, goes into a lot more detail about how to apply the model, or how the model might look in other people. But also Paul talks about the generational drive. And I remember when I first heard that, I was walking up Middleborough Road, and it must have been about 5:30 in the morning with my dog Vincent. And I had to backtrack and go, generational. Generational in my space means generations of people, whereas this is referring to a generator. So most recently, if you live in Melbourne, Australia, we had some pretty disastrous storms here in Melbourne, which wiped the electricity out for about 150,000 people, houses. So they could have all done with a generator to give them some temporary power. But if you think about generational drive and that generator inside of us, it's a power source, and it's something that needs to be fed and kept at a level where it can be activated really high. But there's always that sort of burning pilot light all the time, and we need to be putting really healthy things into that, like big bits of oak and stuff that's going to burn consistently and brightly, rather than a bit of MDF. I think that's that really cheap balsa wood stuff. But being aware of our generational drive, and I know myself, and for any human being, we go through times of life where things do affect us. We might receive feedback that knocks us down a bit, and our drives can really, really lower. So that aggression drive can really take a hit, and you rock bottom, and then you may feel also your pleasure drive is at the same level. That is okay. Imagine just sitting in that space with yourself, allowing yourself time, allowing yourself space and permission to feel. The beautiful kaleidoscope that is the human condition involves things like sadness and grief and misery, as well as joy and delight and agency, and anger is part of that as well. So we have many, many, many emotions on our kaleidoscope of conditions. So being aware of your generational drive and where it's at, and most importantly, what it needs. Sometimes people would describe, they're in the presence of people who really drag them down. Perhaps they're not people, whilst they're very nice people, they might not be people that help you build your generational drive, that keep that generator going for you. Or it even could be your occupation. Just turning up and earning money just isn't doing it for you, and you're just feeling depressed and melancholy, and quite often dangerously people will then attend their GP and talk about these feelings, and unfortunately might be misdiagnosed with depression and be medicated for that. Now I'm going off in a bit of a tangent there, I know. But I think, again, the brilliance of this model, when you apply it to self and apply it to others, we can get a bit of a snapshot on where to start in the journey of working out what's going on. Because, again, hearkening back to me, I had a pretty unstable structure, but a very clear function and very high aggressive drive, pretty low pleasure drive. However, over time, I've spent a lot of exploration and a lot of journeying in building a foundation underneath myself, that even though my structure still remains with its damaged pieces, its rickety bits, its bits that didn't actually realize their full potential, that's all still there. However, the foundation underneath I've built is so strong that it enables me to keep my aggression drive mostly high and my pleasure drive mostly high. And so you probably heard earlier in the show that Andrew Huberman, through his podcast around what alcohol does to your mind and body and mental health, I listened to that very, very early on in my sobriety journey. And it was one of the things that probably sits with me to this day, the why. Why I never want to drink alcohol again. It's not so much the what. So, well, thanks for listening to all of that. It's not often that I get to sit in Studio 1 here at 3WBC on my own and just yak away, but I do feel that I've got Dr. Paul Conti with me, and he's coming up next after the break. And also I have Rose, George and Evelyn through their music choices. So I hope you're all enjoying our time, and there's much more to come, but it's also time for that next song request. And this one is another one from my Rosie Posey, and it's called Rita Is Gone by the Marcus King Band. I wonder what that's all about, and I really do hope Rita eventually came back. So welcome back, dare I say, Rita. The time is just 2 minutes past 11 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney. And I'm unpacking a recent interview with Dr. Paul Conti, a Stanford and Harvard trained psychiatrist who has empowered the lives of many people around the globe, including Lady Gaga, Kim Kardashian and Tommy Hilfiger. So there you go, and probably many more. I know he's influenced me. Might have to just put a little bit of a apology in here. I'm looking at the clock on the panel here at 3WBC and it says 12 past 3, and I may have been announcing the time 1 hour into the future all through the show. So I'm sure you all know anyway, but in the event that you are very early to an event, well, you're early. That's good. Now, that was a really, really great little segment with Paul Conti, and also unpacking the pillars of mental health. And we're going now to another segment, and I'm not going to tell you too much about it. I'm just going to let you work it out for it yourself, and I'll be right back to commentate again. So don't go away. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC, and I'll be right back. If that all makes sense.
Sure. I think we approach the person in a way that is methodical. Now there may be something that's very outstanding, like a trauma that happened 10 years ago. Life was different after that. Like, we're going to go and want to understand more about that, right? We're going to want to understand a lot about that. Or if things are unclear, we're going to want to understand more about the person's narrative, right? Like, we want information to come in. Once we have that information, we're going to go and look at the cupboards or cabinets, so to speak, under the structure and function of self. So most of what goes on in our brains goes on unconsciously. Like, why would we not?
About 80% we operate unconsciously and about 20% consciously at all times?
I mean, there's a lot of ways of looking at this, and coming up with different numbers, right? But what we can say very clearly is the vast majority, which is probably significantly more than 80%, is going on unconscious. And we kind of know that. If you look at how the brain lights up and you can say, okay, there's a billion neuronal connections going off now. Like, I'm aware of one thing, right? There's a lot going on inside of me that's subserving, coming to whatever that one thing is that I'm thinking. So far more than 80% is going on in us unconsciously. So why wouldn't we start looking at that? If my life is not going well and I'm not happy about it, and I'm coming to a person for problem solving, or I'm thinking about myself, or I'm writing, or I'm talking to a friend, the place to start is, what are the givens, the things I automatically think or feel about myself that I don't even acknowledge unless I'm looking for them. So for example, people who've been through, say, denigrated over time, seen as less than, right? Abused, whether it's directly abused or marginalized by the society around us, may have something very reflexive, like, well, things can't be okay for me, or like, I can only go so far. I can only do so much. No one will love me. I'm not good enough for the job or career I want. Like, these are things that are often automatic in a person. They're not leading with this. It's before what they're leading with, right? Their unconscious mind has all these parameters that say, you are cursed. You can't do this. You can't do that. I mean, this was in my own life for a long time, this feeling of being cursed. And I mean, what boundaries does that put around you if you feel that you're cursed, right? Like, we have to go look at that, right? Because that's determining the entire climate of everything else that happens, right? So this is just one example where given that what you said was kind of a broad, comprehensive example of someone who's like, really needs to kind of start at that square one, but there are a lot of ways of entering that system. Maybe the person is healthier, but boy, there's a real salience bias, right? Like, they're focused on one thing that they think is going to make them feel better. Like, for example, making money. Making money is salient. I'm going to feel better that way. It's going to make my life better. Everything's going to be okay. Why is that so salient? Like, we need to go look at that. Maybe in some ways that makes sense for that person, but more likely than not, that focus is coming at the expense of something else, which is why people who often feel that way, where money is very salient and that's how they're going to make their way and feel better about themselves, do not feel better when they have done that, right? So that might be, it's just a different example saying, hey, let's go look at salience. Right? Let's look at that, right? Or maybe we look at the defensive structure, someone who is very commonly avoiding, denying, rationalizing. These are aspects of a defensive structure that would say, if you're always kind of avoiding, but you want to be successful, let's go look at that, right? So what we're doing is we're taking stock of all the clues, and we're going where the money's at, so to speak. Like, where do you dig? Where X marks the spot? Where are we going to dig? Sometimes it's like, let's start at the beginning with the unconscious mind, because that is the beginning, right? That's the true beginning. Sometimes we might say, no, the data is leading us somewhere else. Like, let's take a look at salience. What is this person focused on to the exclusion maybe of other things? What is this person's defensive structure? How are they approaching the world around them? They're just examples, but there's nothing that's going to ail us. There's nothing that ails humans that we can't put into that framework, because the framework is comprehensive.
And I think, to the side of that, your iceberg model that you create, you're talking about defense systems there, but you talk about a nest and what's going on underneath the water, but the nest being, healthy defenses and non-healthy
Right.
defenses. Can you describe a little bit more about that for our listeners? I'm going to leave you waiting on that one. What a curious piece, though, how much of an influence our different minds of consciousness affect how we function. So if you imagine the iceberg above and below the water, and as Paul described, the vast amount of what we operate on at all times is our unconscious. And also, depending on what theory or modality you come from, we have a subconscious as well. And I'm going to walk you through what my thoughts around that are as well. But in unpacking that, I'll use myself as the social experiment, because that's the safest place to be on Earth, but on air. I know what I keep on saying on Earth. I'm just getting lost in my own echo chamber here. Somebody described a few days ago of people who, sit inside a jar and they have the lid screwed really, really tight, and they just can't get out of this jar to actually read the label to find out what it's all about. And I thought that's a really good analogy sometimes of how I feel about myself. Just I'm locked in this jar and I'm not allowing myself to, or finding a way out to read the label to find out what's really going on. And if I think about the unconscious and subconscious mind, I'm going to take you through my thoughts this morning before I left for the show at 3WBC, and I'm putting this show together. And as I mentioned before, it is a little bit of an entanglement of technical issues that I have to bring all together to make this show seem really seamless. So in my unconscious mind, my unconscious mind is going back to many, many examples during my probably 10 years at 3WBC when things didn't work out on air. There was a time when my laptop crashed. There was a time when things went dead. There was a time when a wrong song played and it had more swear words in it than I would say in an entire day. And if Rose, you're listening in, thank you. You're the one that brought that to my attention all those years ago. So all of these things in my unconscious are coming up for me and making me feel almost panicky. So I'm visualizing in my mind all of the things that are going to go wrong today. And the end point of that is that my listeners are going to have a really terrible experience that is going to impact on my reputation. No one's ever going to listen to my show again, blah, blah, blah. Then one step below that is what I call my subconscious. That's the really murky stuff. That's all the sediment that gets caught in your fuel tank and gets into your fuel lines if you keep running your tank down to empty. I know that having a vintage car, my 1989 BMW 320i, I love that car. However, if I do run that down, the sediment comes up and it gets caught in the fuel lines and it's choking for about a month. So this morning, my fish hook went all the way down into my subconscious and ripped out all the stuff from my childhood, which was, you're not good enough, you've got nothing to say, anything you say is stupid. All of that language is coming up to me. So all of a sudden, my heart is beating out of my chest. And I said to myself, Rae, stop. And I looked at myself in the mirror in my new bathroom. And I said, okay, focus on your heart. How's your heart beating? It's like beating out of my chest. Why? And I just reframed everything. And that's a whole nother exercise that I use in reframing things. But focusing on this model of me and these pillars of mental health that I have for myself and learning to trust in what I actually have. So I started talking to myself in a way of other things that I did know. So I reached down also into my unconscious mind to pull out all of the examples when things did work out, like all the thousands of shows that I've done here at 3WBC that have worked out, that have influenced people, interpreting again this model and going into practice with people and showing them ways of managing themselves, and the amount of feedback I get for people saying, wow, my life is changed, I'm on track, and what that really feels like in terms of being grateful. Gratitude. Paul talks a lot about that, and gratitude has become a big part of how I operate my everyday. So I brought that one in this morning as well. Like, how grateful am I to actually be allowed to come on radio? Radio is one of the most amazing medias ever. It's traditional. It's a bit old school. People say to me all the time, "Oh, Rae, why don't you have a podcast instead?" Well, it's not the same as being in a studio and wrangling with all of these buttons and lights and things and mics. It's fun. It's a lot of fun, and it's a bit of an art as well. So by the time I got to the station, I had been dipping into my unconscious and pulling out some negative stuff, right down into my subconscious and pulling out some really, really alarming things that weren't serving me well. That in my conscious mind, which is what's really happening, I was able to make sense of it and dip down and pull out examples from my unconscious mind where things worked out. So there's a little exercise there that you can maybe practice that kind of mindfulness. Mindfulness isn't all about shutting your eyes and blocking the world out and taking ourselves into a sort of an alpha state. It's about really just being mindful about what's going on with self. So there you go. I think we're up to the next song. I'm looking at the time. It's 15 minutes past 11, although it says 12 on the panel here. I think this next song is a bit of a combination of Josh and Rose. It's an oldie, but such a goodie, and I guess a bit of a baddie. That's again a play on words for me. You guessed it. Somebody guessed it who just walked into the studio. It is Bad Moon Rising by Creedence Clearwater Revival. So don't go away. We're going to be back with a bit more of Paul Conti when I return. That was a bit of a whoa. Welcome back. The time is just 18 minutes past 11 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney, and there's kids running around everywhere outside the studio here, Studio 1 at 3WBC. Such a happy sight to see on a Sunday morning. So we're getting into the final moments of my time in the world of renowned psychiatrist Dr. Paul Conti. So we'll be, I'll be right back once we play this next little segment. Don't go away. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It is 3WBC, and I'm just making sure that I have everything turned off so I can turn it on. Don't go away.
Yeah, the idea being that this nest, so to speak, is sitting, if you imagine the iceberg, right? It's a huge iceberg, right? And there is so much of it under the water. And then some of it is actually sticking up from the water. So there's our unconscious mind, our conscious mind. And then there's a structure we build on top of that, right? And the idea is that the us, the self, like me thinking of who I am, or you thinking, okay, this is me, right? Like that self is in this nest. Right? But the nest is made of something, right? It's the structure, the defensive structure that is around us, that's kind of protecting us, right? We're in the nest and we feel a sense of safety in the nest, right? But what is making us feel safe, right? Is it so for example, I continue to use avoidance is a classical example of an unhealthy defense, right? Now, sometimes it may make sense to avoid things, right? But what we're talking about is an overuse of avoidance, right? I want to get out there and do something, but I'm afraid I'll fail, so I avoid. You know, how many people that want a relationship? They want a relationship. I never meet anybody. Then when you actually go through, even though they met 5 people last week, but they avoided any possibility, that there could be a conversation, right, coming of it. So they're using avoidance, not because they don't want what they want, right? But because they're using avoidance for safety. Right. So the person wants a relationship, but won't engage in the conversations because there's a risk of rejection. Right. There's a risk of failure. There's a risk that they'll feel worse than when they start off. Right. So if that nest has, for example, avoidance is a strong aspect of it, that's not the healthiest way to interface in the world. I don't want to be ensconced in that. Right. But there are other defenses that can be much healthier. So altruism is defense. Something negative happened to me, right? I could become angry about that, frustrated about that, and then pass that negative on to the next person. Now I feel a little bit better. Someone was mean to me. I was mean to someone. -1 + 1 comes out at 0. Like that's not helpful, right? It actually doesn't come out at 0. It's negative for everybody. It doesn't help anyone, including the person who's doing that. But what about altruism? Someone did something negative to me. You know what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something positive for the next person. Right? Like that's real. This is not pie in the sky. I feel differently about myself. If you do something negative to me and I do something negative to someone else, I'm acknowledging you affected me in a negative way. You took something away from me, made me feel less. Now I feel aggrieved and I want to pass that hurt along. That's not a great way to feel about self, right? Let's say I do something negative to you, you do something positive for someone else. You're rejecting what I have done. You're saying like, you can do something negative to me and that doesn't feel good, but you are not taking goodness, care, concern, empathy away from me. Hey, I mean, think about how writ large this is in the world around us. How much of our politics, how much of our social interactions on small levels or big are about this kind of thing of passing along the negative. And you do something negative to me, I'm gonna punish you back. And we see these things happening as society escalates towards greater and greater destructiveness. So again, this is not pie in the sky. Like this is real, and it speaks to what can make individual humans less happy than they could be. Right? If something bad happened to me and I pass it along to you, that's not great for your life or mine, right? All the way up to, we think of some of the wars, the big conflicts in the world around us, like what's going on there? Are we seeing this kind of thing on a much bigger level? Someone doesn't feel good enough, powerful enough, in control enough, feels a sense of vulnerability, right? Finds people to act out on, say, oh, I'm different than you, better than you, in fact, right? That makes me feel better about myself. Now I'll oppress you and like I have some false sense of superiority. Like this is going on in the world around us on small levels all the way up to giant levels all the time, because we're not stopping and looking at the dynamics of this, right? It's not just on the middle school playground that these things happen, right? They happen throughout adult life, including in people who have the power to hurt other people. Maybe that's just the power of being a parent to someone or being someone's boss, be able to impact their career. Like this sorts of people all the way up to political leadership, right, in ways that are often driven by very unhealthy motives inside the person. We can kind of see very clearly. So from bottom to top of society, this is going on, and it's harmful because we're not looking at it. We're not looking at why. Why is this going on? Why do people have unhealthy defensive structures? Why do people automatically feel aggrieved? Why do some people automatically generate aggression inside of that? Is not generative, right? It's the opposite. Makes aggression inside of someone to cope with that. If we're not interested in these things in us as individual humans, how are we going to be interested in this on a broader level?
Oh,
What's
absolutely.
going on?
I mean, if the curiosity doesn't run both ways, curious about self and curious about others and looking for a why rather than a want, as you're talking through even just wars and things like that and how we judge people based on our own value and belief systems. If, you overlay your model onto everyone and you can see these aggression drives or, proactiveness drives versus pleasure drive. And you see, well, where is pleasure really being derived from? And you talk about, maybe organic pleasure, I could get pleasure looking at a blade of grass, whereas I have clients who can only derive synthetic pleasures, say through drugs and alcohol, because their aggression might be really, really high, but their ability to feel pleasure is very, very low.
Right. Or people can feel, yes, absolutely. And people can have high levels of, whether we call it aggression or assertion, they can have high levels of that and high levels of pleasure. So I'm going to make myself felt in the world around me by making everyone around me miserable. Right? That's what I'm going to do to people around me. And I feel more powerful because I've done that, right? I feel superior. I'm oppressing people around me. I'm being not kind to them. They're intimidated by me. Like people do this all the time. High levels of assertion or aggression, high levels of pleasure. That is the opposite of generative, right? So you can't look at assertion and pleasure and understand anything. You say, what's high assertion, high pleasure? Well, that could be someone doing wonderful things for other people, absolutely wonderful things. Or it could be someone who's doing horrible things to other people. There is no answer from just looking at those two drives. Say, is that generative? Is how I'm asserting myself and how I'm deriving pleasure. Is that constructive? right? Is it making the world around me better? Is it do something that expands the horizons of myself or others? Because that's what makes us happier, right? Including in ourselves. Right? When people are engaging in wanton destruction, everyone knows live by the sword, die by the sword. Like this doesn't make people happy, right? It gives some transient satisfaction. But if we leave out the generative drive part, we leave out the key to understanding everything, right? And by and large, mental health has done that over the years and said, well, there are two drives, assertion or aggression and pleasure. Absolutely not. If you can say you can have those two drives in exactly the same place. And on one end, you could say, okay, there's Mother Teresa. On the other end, maybe you could map that to Hitler, right? You can say, there's a pleasure in destruction to somebody who wants to be destructive, right? But look at how those two people left the world differently, right? Because one was so generative, Mother Teresa, obviously. The other had a complete lack, as non-generative as a human being could be, all destructive. We have to understand that, or we have no ability to understand ourselves as individuals or as historical figures. Or we just don't have an ability to understand people or life, the world around us, without seeing it this way.
No, it's actually listening to you also on the Modern Wisdom podcast recently as well, and intergenerational trauma. And you look at again what you were just describing just then. There's a big why to all of that as well, and I don't think we really are curious enough to go back to find out why somebody has arrived where they are and how they behave like they do. We just look at the what. What have they left? What are they doing? And then, I think in the world of psychology, that's where we apply labels to that, which I don't think is all that useful. Again, modeling things, I think, in a way that's pertaining to an individual and to a particular human being is a lot better way of finding out the why rather than the labeling.
The why rather than the labeling. I think that is absolute metaphor for my whole view on psychology, I guess. My reason for studying what I did at university was very much based in that I didn't want to label people. I didn't want to diagnose people. I wanted to be able to see people in their whole light. And I think that's something that Paul's alluding to there is, I also like the reference to reframing things. Quite often when we're viewing a human being or a situation through our own value system, our own belief system and our own systems of safety, we can often project our own onto somebody else, and you miss the point completely. There was also a piece in there around avoidance and denial. I've got this idea about trust. People talk about trust all the time as like it's a commodity we need. I need you to trust me. I need to trust you. I don't trust anyone. How often do we hear that? I just don't trust anyone. I'm never going to be in a relationship because everybody lets you down. But trust is what we know about people and things. So I've got this idea that trust and avoidance and denial all sit very closely together, because if you can trust that something's always going to let you down or it's never going to work out, then you might actually avoid it or deny that it's happening. And it's just something that I keep on getting my head around when I'm working with people, and also working with my own unconscious bias towards myself. Am I avoiding something because I trust too implicitly that something's going to happen to me? It's a powerful one. But, he talked about defense, unhealthy defense and healthy defense as well. And sometimes when we're seeing defenses in people, we can often, again, take that upon ourselves into our own systems of safety and make that about us. But when a person's protecting themselves, that's a time when, we can actually check in and say, hey, what's all that about? So I'm going to keep moving with the show because I've looked at the time and all of my blah, blah, and all of Paul's really interesting blah, blah has turned into 1.5 hour left of the show. So hopefully this next song is not a metaphor for how the show's going. And there goes my subconscious again. But it's a song, it's called Heading South by Zach Bryan. And this one's also currently doing the round on Rose's playlist. So here it is. don't go away. You're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC. Welcome back. The time is 33 minutes past 11 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC with Rae Bonney, and we're getting to the very final moments of my interview with world-renowned psychiatrist Dr. Paul Conti. And apologies for the expletive in that show. I'll refer that to my daughter Rose, and possibly will not be returning to 3WBC if I get into trouble by the powers that be. Now we're going to jump straight back into these final pieces with Paul and come straight back to you. So hopefully you're enjoying the show. Don't go away because we've still got just that little bit more to go and until we can head off into our Sunday.
Right. Even just look at the example of bullying, right? So on a very opposite level of like world figures, right? Why does someone who's bigger than someone else and therefore like thumping on the person who's smaller? I mean, I'm interested in why the person is doing that. Nobody who feels good about themselves gets pleasure from thumping someone because they happen to be smaller than them, right? So like, what's going on there, right? Why does that person feel so badly about themselves that that's the only way they're feeling some sense of assertion or some sense of transient pleasure? I felt powerful because I thumped that guy. I mean, why? Right? If we go and look at that, that's where we find trauma. Right? We find trauma. I don't know how that happens without some trauma. Now, maybe that's a big trauma. Maybe that boy who's a bully is getting beaten up at home by an adult. Maybe, right? Maybe not, though. Maybe it's something different. Maybe that person has aspirations inside of them they've been told that they won't be able to meet. Maybe making things up. It could be big things or things that are not so obvious. But if the end result is the same, that person doesn't feel good enough about themselves and they're going to assert themselves and gain some pleasure by harming someone else, like, well, why are we not very, very interested in that? I mean, we don't take enough interest in the traumas that people experience that change us as we go forward. That's not a soft concept either. I mean, modern neurobiology tells us that. Modern neuroimaging tells us that, like, people change inside. They become more vigilant, less trusting, right? More aggressive. Like there are changes in us that come from trauma, but we, by and large, are not very interested in that as a society. We're certainly not very interested in preventing it, and look at what makes people feel less than. How do we do that to entire communities? Whether it's socioeconomic status, it's country of origin, it's racial, it's based upon religion or sexual identity, sexuality or gender identity. Like there's so much here that we seem pretty ready as societies to like consign people to some secondary status, right? Without saying, what are we doing to people, right? What are we doing? And also that any time we're doing something to people, we could be one of those people. Yes. Right? I mean, my status changed a lot after the loss of my brother to suicide. I mean, I felt a reflexive shame from that. And, my feeling in the world is now very beleaguered. And so this idea that we're running ahead so fast and blindly that we're trampling people, that's happening all the time. And also, we or someone we love can easily be one of those people. I mean, that's got to be incentive to pay more attention to ourselves, how to understand ourselves, how to make ourselves as individuals and the societies, whether they're the community within a household or on a street or in a town, all the way up to the community of the world. That's how we make those communities better. Yes. But we're not doing that.
No, but I think even there, speaking about trauma, I know that trauma is one of your areas of specialty. But I see trauma, it's so subjective, and trauma probably lives within all of us and is not necessarily a negative experience either. Can you describe a bit about that?
It, though. Right. So it depends how you define it. Like anything time we're talking about, we want to define what it is, right? Right. So trauma gets used so much that the word doesn't have any meaning anymore. Right. So what we would say is, look, how are we defining trauma? Right. I'm defining trauma as something that happens to us, overwhelms our coping skills, and leaves us different in ways that are not subtle and not subjective as we move forward. Right. That's my definition of it. We have to define it some way if we're going to talk about it. Right. And my definition is that's what's so bad right? Because people say, oh, things are traumatic and I grew from it, but that's not something that changed you for the worse. Right? And we know this because the brain biology tells us people are through trauma, for example, that leaves them different. Their vigilance systems behave differently. Their trust systems behave differently, right? They make different choices in all sorts of settings. It's not subjective. It's hard science verified. So if we define trauma that way, then we become very interested. Well, I'm very interested in what has happened to me and left me different going forward. And I want to understand that. And then if we're trying to understand that, we can look at the obvious, right? Someone dies, a bad injury, right? An illness, right? The things that we obviously know, oh, that's traumatic. We can see people can be changed. Sure, acute traumas are one aspect of that, but chronic traumas can change us just the same. And that's not a soft assertion. You can have the same brain biology changes that are clearly, clinically, and scientifically detectable. If you were through a terrible car accident and someone else died in the car, we get that, right? Also, if you were seen as less than because of gender, sexual preference, socioeconomic status, over and over and over, there's a chronic trauma where every day you're getting up in a world that sees you as less than, you can absolutely have those changes too. And so there's acute, there's chronic, and you can have those changes vicariously. Think about them. It's amazing, right? Thank goodness human beings have empathy. But that means that if I have a terrible story of trauma and I tell it to you in detail and you care, so you want to listen and you want to help me, you can come away changed too. Now, that doesn't always happen, but does that happen? Absolutely it does. But do we pay much attention to this? Does it happen to EMTs, right? Does it happen to doctors, nurses, right? Who does it happen to? Caregivers? These things happen to people all the time, and we ignore it because I think we see it as a soft concept, right? But like the science tells us, we can define it in a way that really makes sense, right? Let's look at something that makes us different in a way that is not good, because if we understand that, we can change it back. Like that's the whole point of all of it, right? It's not to look at something that's now bad and hopeless. Like if we can understand that, we can change that back. Like what made you feel less than? Oh, is it society has seen you as less than? Is that how you judge who's more or less than? How does that feel to you? How does that hurt? There's a whole process here where people can feel like I actually am not less than. I do not feel like less. I do not feel like I can't do things. That's how people heal and change their lives for the better. And that's how we go back to the structure and function of self and the drives. We go back and look at that. And that's what we say, oh, on the other side of that can be healing, health, happiness, as defined by having some peace, contentment, and delight in our lives.
What about trauma as accelerated learning?
Can you help me understand that a little bit? Help me understand that.
Well, I don't know if you described it or somebody else, but I think the analogy was around, as a small child, you put your hand on the stove and burn it. And so you have this really severe trauma. It's a physical trauma and it's a mental trauma. From then on, that child will never go near a stove again and will never put its hand on a live hot plate. So that's accelerated learning. You've learned that thing very early in life. So it's actually a protective thing now, this piece of trauma. So we actually learn through trauma, and I'm sure you're very familiar with trauma-informed therapy, which is, a modality that I really enjoy working with myself. But I think we can learn a lot from trauma to inform ourselves as we move through life. That's a really positive experience when we can make sense of it.
You have to define the words, right? Not in the way that I am defining trauma. Now, again, you can define trauma other ways too. Let's say you define trauma as there's a physical injury to the person, or there's mental and emotional distress. So now let's say you take one child who puts a finger on a hot stove. He's like, ouch, that hurts. Like, wow, that's bad. And the finger gets burned and gets some blisters. And like, that does not feel good. And that was shocking. And the person learns, don't touch that anymore. Okay, they've learned something from that, right? Their brain is not different. Is that the same as a child who puts their hand on something very hot and has a permanent scar? Again, I'm citing, there's a lot of gray in between us, but I'm citing something that is, in my view, completely different. And I think not just in my view, the science tells us is completely different. Now that child is scarred, or that child is in the hospital, or that pain lasts for months, right? And now that person is afraid of fire. And now that person can't go on a camping trip at school because there's going to be a fire there, or can't do all sorts of things that they're interested in doing. Can't be near a fireplace. Like, that's not good. Why? Because if we define trauma as something that overwhelms our coping skills, changes us, and leaves us different going forward, that first child learned a good lesson. Don't touch something hot, it hurts. That's great, right? That second child has a brain that is changed for the worse after that incident. So who suffered trauma? The second child, not the first. Each of them hurt their hand. Each of them was distraught. But again, we have to put definitions one way or another. And I think, why would we not define trauma as something that impacts us so much that we are different? We don't have a word for that. Now, so why it seems like trauma is a good word for it. And when we look at what trauma does, when we think of classical trauma, military trauma, combat, losing people, we're talking about people who are different. I mean, the whole concept came from after World War I and people being shell-shocked, right? And people realized, well, yeah, that was the impact of trauma. They left for the war in a certain way, and they came back different, right? Because they were traumatized in the middle, right? And their sense of safety, their sense of the whole world, everything was changed for them. So people became interested in that. That's where modern concepts of PTSD evolved. The whole concept of trauma in the modern world comes from changes in us that leave us different going forward, but we're not adhering to that anymore. And then we have too many different definitions, which is just what we do as humans. So let's define it one way that seems like a very operational, like helpful, practical way of defining it.
Mm. Thanks for clarifying that. That was a really good description. And I think you're right about trauma. It's it's how long is a piece of string and where can you go with it? Because again, everybody has an experience of trauma, which is relative to their life, really. Paris Hilton breaks a fingernail. That could be very traumatic for her.
We could define, think about in the two children, we could say both of them had a physical injury. Both of them had an emotional shock that might have thrown them off for a couple of days, each of them, but only one had trauma, the one that's changed for the worse by the experience. That person learned not to touch hot things. That person also learned not to go near anything that has fire. That's not adaptive.
Mm.
That limits that person, fills that person with fear and an inability to navigate the world. So I would argue we can say there's physical and emotional injury, but trauma is change for the worse. That can be changed back for the better.
It can be.
If we understand. True, that's the point of going to the structure of self, function of self, looking at drive states is that child doesn't, so that person now is an adult and they have a scarred hand and they can't go near a campfire. Like, that can be worked through. We can look at, there's a whole set of now unconscious processes, how fearful fire is, what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do. Let's go back and look at all that. I mean, it's absolutely the case that people who are in that position then can be sitting by a campfire and doing something they really want to do and haven't been able to do for the last 35 years.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it can change, but it's not going to change without us applying knowledge and understanding in a process in order to figure out what's going on, what has changed, how do we understand that, how do we help it change back? That's how we heal. The point of all of it is healing. Well, it's healing and prevention, right? It's healing what's already there and preventing what will come in the future if we don't pay attention to it. By the way, I know it's low, but I'm so sorry. I'm going to pivot in a second that I've left someone. Is this okay? No, I want to go.
That is absolutely. Can I just ask you one quick question just to end up? And thank you so much, because I know we have gone right over time. I just wanted to know, like, you are so amazingly well educated, gifted, well read, but who do you learn from?
I think there's so much for us to learn from. It's like observe people in the world around us, listen to people who seem to have something smart to say, whether they're a lot older than us or a lot younger. I learn a lot from my 5-year-old's observations, right? Because they're real and true and honest. And I learn a lot from senior practitioners in my field. I mean, there's so much for us to learn from. We just have to be open to the learning, including curiosity about self. Well, why do I have current thoughts in my head? What's that doing there? Right. So we can learn from others who are alive and around us. We can learn from people who've been wise throughout history. We think has something to say and has some wisdom in them. We can learn from the outside of us. We can also learn from the inside of us too. There's so much learning to be had. We just have to be curious.
On that note, being curious, wow, what a privilege it was to be able to speak with Dr. Paul Conti directly. There's just so much more you can learn from him. And if you're keen, just dial into the Huberman Lab podcast series that features Paul. It's 4 parts that kicked off, I think, in August 2023, and I'll put it in the show notes once it's produced onto the YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. I'll also have links through to the pillars of mental health and iceberg models we spoke about today. Bit of a shout out to Matt Gans. I said Met. He's not in New Zealand. He's actually in China. Matt's a very dear friend of mine who is a whole nother story. In fact, I'm going to ask Matt formally on air right now if he'd like to be a guest on the show this year. I'm not going to give too much away, but he's a man who's accomplished so much in a very short period of time. So finally we get to granddaughter Evelyn's one of 2 favourite songs of all time. This one is Wake Me Up Before You Go Go by Wham, and it's a song that I showed to her when she was a newborn. And for some reason, actually we know the reason because it's a bloody good song, she just took to it like a duck to water, and I play it to her every time I'm with her and I need to wake her up. I play that song and she loves it. If she's crying and she's upset, pop on a bit of George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley and Wham, and she is so happy. The second favourite song, of course, I have to say this on Rose's behalf, is the Collingwood theme song. So we're going to be right back after this quick break, and then we're going to wrap the show. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in today. Here we go. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go Wham. Wow, welcome back. The time is 54 minutes past 11 and you're listening to 94.1 FM. It's 3WBC, and I just got the most amazing video from Rose, and it's Evelyn tuning into her song Wake Me Up Before You Go Go by Wham, and she's just stiff with excitement and can't work out where I am in the phone. So Evelyn, I will see you tomorrow for the Rah and Evelyn special fun day. Also, Matt Gans is with his daughter Zoe in China, so they've sent another message. So a big shout out to you, Zoe. Give your dad a big hug from me. He's a pretty cool guy, and you're a very cool girl. So when I'm next on the show, please send through some song requests. So what a great show by Paul. We covered off on so many things relating to the human condition, and some of the discussion may have brought up uncomfortable feelings for listeners. So please remember, help is there. Here's a few options for further support. Lifeline is 131114. The suicide callback service is 1300 659 467, and emergency services 000 here in Australia. And wherever else you are in the world, that's yours. Well, that's not yours. I don't know what yours is. Anyway, you can also visit my website if you want to get in touch or connect with the many mental health and wellbeing resources that are there. Just go to rae@raebonney.au. That's pretty cool, isn't it? No .com. Remember that, it's .au. So that's also my email address if you want to engage there. Now, as we march toward the 3rd month of the year, which is March, I'll be preparing to meet live in the studios at 3WBC a very accomplished actor and writer. Her name is Maria Angelico. She's one of the current stars on the Australian drama called Strife, recently released on Binge, and also starring Asha Keddy. I've watched it and I loved it. I thought it was going to go down a bit of a feminist rant, but in fact it's a really well-balanced piece, and Maria plays one of the starring roles in that show, and I also know her from somewhere else, which we will get into in the March show. I'm not going to let too much away here, but you might even remember her from Chris Lilly's We Can Be Heroes. She was in that as a much younger person. Sisters, Glitch, and so many more. I can't wait to learn more about what it feels like being Maria Angelico. Speaking of great women, coming up next is the divine Paula Hogg. She's just actually walked into the studios to roll out an entire lazy Sunday afternoon full of music, banter, bound to get you really, really relaxed. So given that she's just walked into the studio, I will have time for my very last song request. Now, this one's a bit special. And hopefully Rose is still tuning in, because Rose, this is a song that is dedicated to you. It's from your true love, Joshua Galloway, and it's to his true love. He said, "Can you please play this from Joshua Galloway to my Rosie?" So specifically here, so that's not specifically, it definitely is here. Rose, this is to you from your Joshy. It's probably got something to do with your hairs. It's called Wondering Why by the Red Clay Strays. And you do have a lot of strays. I find them around the house all the time. They get tangled around all and sundry. But anyway, thank you everybody for listening in. Again, special shout out to my family. I love you guys so much. Matt, Gans, thanks for tuning in. Zoe, hello. And have a joyful day, everyone. And remember, perhaps just ask someone that question. It actually got trademarked officially this week. What does it feel like being you today? So without further ado, he's Wondering Why. It's from Joshua Galloway for Rose.